Light came to the Chateau de Foix as a gradual seepage of grey through the narrow windows of the chancery, a slow dilution of the dark that had filled the room all night. You stood before the clerk's table with your hands resting at your sides, still a little stiff from the cold of the early morning, and watched the flame of the single candle on the tabletop bend and straighten in a draught that came from somewhere under the door. The clerk was an old man with thin hair and fingers stained dark from ink, and he worked without speaking, his quill scratching across a slip of parchment in a script so small and neat it looked like the tracks of a bird in mud. When he had finished writing, he sprinkled sand over the wet ink, waited a moment, and then tipped the sand into a clay pot before folding the parchment twice and pressing it into your palm. This was the route, a list of towns where you might stop, fords that were passable at this season, bridges to avoid, and the name of the man to whom you would deliver the sealed letter at the end of your journey. You studied it by the candlelight, tracing the lines with your forefinger, while the clerk watched you with patient, colourless eyes, and you memorized the names one by one until you could recite them in silence without looking. When you had finished, the clerk opened a wooden coffer on the table and drew out a leather pouch, small and flat, its surface worn smooth by much handling. Inside it was the letter, already sealed with a disc of dark red wax that bore the impress of the Count's ring, and the pouch was closed with a twisted linen cord that the clerk tied in a knot he showed you how to recognize. He placed the cord into your hands and waited while you hung the pouch around your neck, settling it beneath your tunic so that it lay flat against your chest, and then he counted out a purse of coins from a second coffer and pushed them across the table without comment. The coins were small and silver, and you put them into the pouch at your belt next to your flint and tinder. The clerk then gestured toward a side door that led to the stable yard, and you followed him out into a morning that was just beginning to define itself. The sky above the courtyard, a pale milky grey, in which the last few stars were still faintly visible. In the yard a groom held a horse that you had never seen before, a plain bay gelding with a calm eye and a heavy winter coat that had not yet shed. Its tack was simple but well kept, the saddle oiled and the bridle supple, and the groom handed you the reins with a brief nod before disappearing into the warmth of the stables. You checked the girth and the stirrup leathers by habit, running your hands over the buckles, and then you mounted and sat for a moment in the saddle, while the horse shifted its weight and blew a soft breath into the cold air. The weight of the sealed letter was a small, firm presence against your ribs, and you touched it once through the cloth before gathering the reins and turning the horse toward the gate. The town of Foix was still asleep as you rode through the narrow streets. A baker's oven glowed through the open door of a bakehouse, the firelight flickering on the stone walls, and the smell of warm bread spread out into the lane and followed you for a dozen paces. A dog trotted across the wet cobbles ahead of you, its nails clicking, and it paused to look at you with the mild curiosity of an animal that had no reason to fear strangers, then continued on its way. A woman opened a shutter on an upper floor and shook out a cloth, the sound soft and far away. Otherwise nothing moved, and the only noise was the slow clopping of the horses' hooves on stone and the distant rush of the Ariege River below the town walls. You passed through the gate without challenge, the watchman huddled in his box with a blanket around his shoulders and his chin on his chest, and then the town fell behind you and the road opened into the valley. The Ariege ran beside the road on your right hand, a broad, fast river of pale green water that filled the morning with its steady murmur. A thin fog lay on the surface, shifting and folding back on itself in long, slow ribbons that rose and dissolved as the sun began to touch the tops of the hills. The road followed the river north, climbing very gently between slopes covered in oak and chestnut, their branches still bare and dark against the brightening sky. You rode at a walk, letting the horse warm its muscles, and you felt the last stiffness of sleep leaving your own body as the motion of the saddle rocked you gently from side to side. The light grew stronger as you rode, the grey of the sky thinning to a pale blue that held no clouds, and the fog on the river began to lift in earnest, pulling away from the water in long white sheets that rose straight up and vanished into the air. The valley walls on either side were steep and wooded, their lower slopes dotted with the dark shapes of sheep that moved slowly through the dead bracken, and high above them the peaks of the Pyrenees were just visible, as a distant jagged line of white and grey against the southern horizon. You did not look back at them. You had seen those mountains every day of your life, and they held no novelty. Instead, you watched the road ahead, a pale ribbon of packed earth and stone that wound along the riverbank and disappeared around a bend half a mile distant, and you let the horse choose its own pace as the sun climbed higher and the day began to warm. The road was empty. Once you passed a small shrine carved into the rock face beside the track, a niche no larger than a bread loaf, its painted figure so warm that only the outline of a robe and a raised hand remained. Someone had left a handful of wildflowers at its base, now brown and dry, and a single beeswax candle stub that had melted into a pool of pale wax on the stone. The sight of it passed without stopping, and the road continued, winding through a stand of pine trees that grew close to the water, their trunks straight and dark, and their needles carpeting the ground in a soft reddish-brown that muffled the hoofbeats to a whisper. The air under the pines was cool and still, smelling of resin and damp earth, and the river's murmur was louder here, bouncing off the trunks so that it seemed to come from every direction at once. You emerged from the pines into a stretch of open pasture where the valley widened slightly and the river ran over a bed of pale stones, its surface broken into 1,000 small ripples that caught the sun. A heron stood in the shallows on the far bank, a tall grey shape as motionless as the stones around it, and you watched it for a long moment before it extended its wings with a slow, deliberate beat and lifted itself into the air, its long legs trailing behind as it flew upstream and out of sight. The horse did not startle. It had seen the heron before you had, and it simply continued walking with its head low and its ears flicking back and forth. The morning passed in a slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats and birdsong and the endless murmur of the river, and the sun rose to its mid-morning height and hung there, pale and warm on your shoulders. The road began to climb away from the river, leaving the valley floor and rising into the first low hills through a series of gentle switchbacks that the horse took without effort. The trees here were mostly chestnut, their trunks old and deeply grooved, and the path was covered with fallen leaves that rustled under the hooves with a sound like dry paper. Through the gaps in the trees you could see the valley falling away behind you, the river a silver thread far below, and the road you had travelled a pale line that disappeared into the haze of the south. You did not pause to look. You kept your eyes on the path ahead, where the hills rolled on one after another into the blue distance, and you rode into them with the sealed letter warm against your heart and the long journey stretching before you like a quiet road with no end. You leave the river valley behind before the sun has fully broken free of the hills. The track you follow was never a proper road, only a drover's path worn into the earth by centuries of sheep and goats moving between summer pastures and winter folds. It climbs gently through a forest of chestnut trees, their trunks old and deeply grooved, their leaves now brown and curled at the edges, but still thick on the branches. The air is cool and still, holding the faint scent of damp leaf mold and the distant sweetness of wood smoke from some unseen charcoal pit. Your horse walks with a slow, steady rhythm, its hooves making a soft crushing sound on fallen chestnut husks that lie split open like little hedgehogs along the way. For a long while, you see no one. The forest floor rises and falls in easy folds, the path avoiding the steepest slopes by winding between the roots. Light falls in pale shafts through gaps in the canopy, shifting whenever the breeze stirs the higher branches. You notice the green of moss on the north sides of the trunks, the way a single thread of spider silk catches the sun, the small rustlings of unseen birds in the undergrowth. The only sounds are the creak of saddle leather, the occasional snort of your horse, and the soft whisper of dry leaves brushing against your leg as the way narrows between thickets of old hazel. After a time, the trees thin just enough to offer a view across a shallow valley. On the far slope, a shepherd stands motionless, leaning on a staff, his flock a scattering of white dots that move slowly over the pale grass. You watch him for a few strides, but he does not turn. He is too far to call to, and you have no reason to call. The sight recedes as the path dips into a hollow where a stream crosses the track, its water so clear you can count the small grey stones at the bottom. You let the horse lower its head and drink, the sound of its sucking mingling with the stream's own quiet trickle. You dismount, crouch on the bank, and splash cold water onto your face. It tastes of wet stone and the high hills where it began. From the saddlebag you take a piece of hard bread, the color of old ivory, and a sliver of cheese wrapped in a cloth. Eating takes a few minutes, and you do it standing, resting your shoulders against the horse's warm flank while it crops the short grass at the water's edge. Nothing moves in the trees around you except a single yellow leaf that spirals down and lands on the stream to be carried away so slowly it hardly seems to move at all. When you mount again, the sun has climbed a little higher, but the air remains cool, the sky visible now as a pale blue sheet between the chestnut crowns. The path leads you out of the wood and across a strip of common grazing land, tufted and uneven, then into a second stretch of trees where the trunks are younger and the undergrowth thinner. Here the horse picks up its pace slightly, perhaps sensing a familiar route, and you let the reins go slack so it can find its own way over the exposed roots. The rhythm of the walk becomes something you stop noticing, like your own breathing, and for a while your thoughts drift without direction, settling on nothing in particular, the shape of a cloud, the color of the leather pouch that holds the letter, the memory of the hearth smoke in the chancery at Foix, all passing and fading as the path continues. You emerge into open country again near midday, the sun now directly overhead and weak enough to look at through the thin overcast that is spread across the sky. Ahead lies a village, 6 stone houses clustered around a well in a depression of the land, so that you see their roofs before you see the doors. Smoke rises straight up from one chimney. The other chimneys are cold. The houses are built of the same grey stone that litters the fields, their roofs made of heavy slabs that overlap like the scales of a fish. A narrow lane runs between them, unpaved and marked with the prints of cartwheels that have hardened into the mud. You ride through at a walk, passing close enough to the well to see the rope and bucket hanging from the crossbeam, the stone lip worn smooth by countless hands. No one comes out, though you hear the low murmur of voices from within one of the dwellings and the clatter of a wooden spoon against an iron pot. A dog lying in a patch of sun opens one eye, watches you pass, and closes it again. The village falls behind you in less than 100 heartbeats, and the silence returns, deeper than before. Beyond the village, the land flattens into a wide plain of harvested fields. The stubble stretches in every direction, a rough carpet of ochre and pale brown that catches the low afternoon light and holds it. The path now runs alongside a low stone wall, beyond which the fields lie in long strips separated by grassy balks. Here and there a lone tree stands, its branches bare, a rook perched in its fork. You pass an abandoned plough left at the edge of a field, its iron share still shining from the last cut, and a little further on, a heap of stones cleared from the soil over many generations, now covered in bramble and ivy. The hooves of your horse kick up small puffs of dust that hang in the still air before settling back onto the path. Nothing else moves on the plain except the shadows of clouds that drift across the fields like slow, silent ships. As the afternoon wears on, the sun drops toward the rim of the hills you left that morning, and the light turns golden, then amber, then the soft grey-blue of early dusk. You notice the temperature cooling, the first hint of evening damp rising from the earth. The path leads you toward a small hamlet tucked into a fold of the land, no more than a cluster of farm buildings around a muddy yard. A barn stands at the edge, its great doors open, and you can see hay stacked to the roof beams inside. You ride up to the door and sit for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of cattle moving in the byre attached to the barn, the lowing of a calf, the shuffle of hooves on straw. A man appears from the house nearby, older, with a face as weathered as the fields, carrying a wooden bucket in one hand. He looks at you without surprise, as if travelers on this path are common enough, and you raise a hand in greeting. You do not speak much. You indicate the barn, the gathering night, and he nods once, gesturing toward the hayloft with the bucket. Then he turns and goes back inside, and you hear the door close with a soft wooden thud. You lead the horse to a water trough beside the barn wall, loosen the girth but leave the saddle on, and rub down its legs with a handful of straw. The horse drinks deeply, then stands with its head low, already half asleep. Inside the barn, the air is warm and thick with the smell of hay, dried grass, and the sweet musk of cattle. A wooden ladder leads up to the hayloft. You climb carefully, the rungs smooth under your hands. The loft is a wide platform of planks covered in a deep layer of loose hay that rustles as you kneel and spread your cloak out as a bed. Light enters through a small, unshuttered window high in the gable, just enough to see by, and you watch the last colour drain from the sky while you settle yourself against the soft mound of hay. The leather pouch with the letter you place beside you, its familiar weight, a small comfort. You eat a strip of dried meat you have been carrying, its saltiness sharp on your tongue, and wash it down with a sip of water from the leather bottle at your belt. Below, the cows shift their weight from one foot to another, their heavy bodies brushing against the wooden partitions with low, resonant thuds. You hear a cow cough once, then the slow rhythm of chewing as they work their cud, a steady, endless sound that fills the barn like the breathing of the building itself. An owl calls somewhere in the fields beyond, a single soft note that fades into the quiet. You lie back and feel the tiredness of the day's ride settling into your legs and shoulders, a dull ache that is not unpleasant, merely the body's way of counting the miles. The hay smells of summer cut and stored, and you pull a little of it over your feet. The letter rests in its pouch, the seal still whole, the cord still tight. Tomorrow you will find the old Roman road, but tonight there is nothing to do but listen to the cattle and let the dark press gently against the window until your eyes close and the slow pull of sleep draws you under. Day 2 begins with a thin rain that patters on your wool cloak before you even open your eyes. You wake in the hayloft to the sound of it on the roof, a soft and steady hush that has been falling for some time, soaking the yard and the fields in the still dark shapes of the cattle below. The hay around you is warm where your body has pressed into it, and for a moment you lie still, listening to the rain and the cows shuffling in the byre, their low breaths of familiar rhythm you have already grown used to. Then you sit up, brush the loose straw from your tunic, and check the leather pouch at your chest. The seal is still whole, the cord dry, and you tuck it back inside before climbing down the ladder. The barn door stands open to a world of grey. The rain is not heavy, but persistent, a drizzle so fine it seems to hang in the air as much as fall, collecting on every surface in beads that run together and drip slowly. You walk to the trough, wash your face with water that is colder than the rain, and watch your horse standing under the overhang of the barn roof with one hind leg cocked and its eyes half closed. You saddle it without hurry, working the damp leather of the girth through the buckle, and you notice the farmer has left a small clay bowl of milk on the mounting block by the door, a gesture you acknowledge with a nod toward the house, though no face appears at the window. The milk is warm and tastes of the cowshed, and after drinking it, you feel ready to move. You mount and ride out of the hamlet while the rain continues its gentle tapping on your hood and shoulders. The wool of your cloak grows heavier as it absorbs the moisture, releasing a smell of wet sheep that blends with the scent of damp earth and stone. The track from the barn leads across a muddy yard, through a gate left open, and onto a narrow lane that runs between hedgerows of blackthorn, their bare twigs holding droplets that catch what little light the sky offers. The horse walks with its head low, and you let it follow the lane without guidance, until the hedgerows end and the land opens wide into a plain of pale, washed-out colours. Here you join a section of the old Roman road that still runs straight across the country, its paving stones broken and grass-grown but easy to follow. It arrives suddenly, a line of grey slabs emerging from the turf at an angle, and you turn onto it as naturally as you might step onto a stair. The surface is uneven, the stones tilted by frost and roots, but the way is broad and unmistakable. It points directly across the plain with the confidence of something built to last and then forgotten. You adjust to the harder footing, the horse's hooves now making a sharper, more irregular sound as they strike stone and clod and grass in turn. The rain continues, making the stones glisten darkly, and you pull your hood a little further forward so that your world becomes a small circle of sight framed by wet wool. For the first hour, The road passes through fields that lie fallow, their furrows filled with rainwater that reflects the sky in long silver stripes. You pass an abandoned wayshrine set back from the road among a clump of elders, a small stone niche with a pointed roof and a carving so worn by weather that you can make out only the faint suggestion of a figure, perhaps a saint or a local spirit, its features smoothed into a gentle blankness. The niche is empty, holding nothing but a puddle and a few sodden leaves, and you wonder without urgency who last left an offering here and when. The elders drip steadily onto the shrine's little roof, a sound so soft it is barely separate from the rain. And then you are past it, and the road has swallowed the view behind you. A milestone appears after 1,000 paces, just as the old maps promised, a squat cylinder of stone set upright beside the road with a worn inscription that once recorded distances in Roman numerals. You can trace the carved lines with your eyes but cannot read them, the letters eroded into shallow grooves that fill with water as you watch. Counting milestones becomes a way to measure the morning, each one arriving after a long, steady interval of walking, their surfaces hosting little colonies of pale grey lichen that spread in circles like maps of unknown islands. You notice after the third stone that the rain is easing, the drops growing lighter and less frequent until they stop altogether, leaving only a fine mist that wets your face without sound. The sky remains a flat, pale grey, a single unbroken sheet from horizon to horizon, and the light becomes shadowless, making distances hard to judge. Without the rain, the plain seems quieter still. The only sound the horse's hooves and the occasional wet gasp of a clod of earth turning underfoot. You pass a long stretch where the road has sunk slightly into the surrounding land, creating a shallow ditch on either side where water stands in pools the color of strong tea. Reeds have grown up in these ditches, their dry stalks rattling softly when a breath of wind moves across the plain, a sound like tiny bones shaken in a bag. You watch a heron lift from one of the pools and flap slowly away, its wings laboring but carrying it out of sight with an unhurried dignity. And then the road straightens again, and there is nothing ahead but the pale stripe of stones leading to a vanishing point in the grey distance. Your horse's pace is a steady walk, the same pace it has kept since you left the barn, and you feel your body settling into the motion, your hips rocking gently with each stride. You do not push the horse faster because there is no need, and the animal seems content to move at its own rhythm, its ears flicking back and forth to catch sounds you cannot hear. The saddle creaks with a sound like a door opening slowly, over and over, and the reins shift in your hands with a slight, continuous pull. You count milestones until you lose track of the number, then you stop counting and simply note them as they pass, each one a little older and more worn than the last, their inscriptions fading until they are only smooth stone cylinders that mark the road without words. In the late morning the mist burns off, revealing a wider landscape of gentle undulations, low hills that rise so slowly you hardly notice the climb until you look back and see the plain spread behind you like a wrinkled blanket. The road continues its straight course regardless of the terrain, cutting through the rises in shallow causeways and crossing the dips on low embankments that the Romans had built with layers of rammed earth and stone, still holding firm after all these centuries. You feel the road's age under you, the weight of the thousands who have walked and ridden this same line. But the thought does not linger. It drifts across your mind like one of the clouds that still hang in the west, and then it is gone. At the top of a slight rise, you see a figure ahead, moving slowly in the same direction as yourself, and you catch up to it over the course of half an hour, until you can make out a carter walking beside a pair of heavy horses that pull a wagon loaded with barrels. The barrels are bound with wooden hoops and stacked in 2 tiers, and they give off a faint, sour smell of cider apples even from a distance. The carter is a broad man in a patched tunic, his face reddened by weather, and he turns his head as you approach and gives you a single nod, a greeting that requires no words. You slow your horse to match the wagon's pace for a moment, and the carter says without breaking stride that the ford ahead is passable, the water only knee-deep on a horse, and that a good inn lies just beyond the river. You thank him with a nod of your own and ride on, leaving the wagon and its steady creak of axles behind. The exchange was so brief that within a few minutes you can no longer hear the wagon, and the man might have been a passing thought. The ford appears after another hour, marked by a break in the roadside vegetation where the grass gives way to a slope of packed gravel leading down to a river. The water is shallow and clear, running over a bed of small stones in colors of grey, brown, and the occasional flash of white quartz. It spreads wide across the gravel, no deeper than the carter promised, and the current is so gentle it hardly ripples. You let the horse pick its way down the bank, its hooves crunching on the gravel, and then it steps into the water with a splash that sounds very loud in the quiet landscape. The water reaches just below your horse's knees, and you feel the slight resistance of the current, the coolness of it even through your boots. The horse stops once in the middle to lower its head and drink, and you let it, watching the water flow around its legs and hearing the soft gurgle of the stream. Then it walks on, and you climb the far bank onto a track that leads away from the river through a stand of alders. Beyond the alders, exactly where the carter said it would be, stands an inn built of the same grey stone as every other building in this region, its roof of heavy slabs and its chimney sending up a thread of smoke that rises straight in the still air. The inn has a sign hanging from an iron bracket, a painted wooden board that shows a sheaf of wheat, faded but recognizable, and a low door that stands half open. A stable boy of about 12 appears from a side yard and takes your horse without being asked, leading it toward a long, low building where you can see other horses already stabled, their heads over the half doors. You enter the inn by ducking under the low lintel, and the inside is a single large room with a floor of packed earth and a ceiling of dark beams so low you can reach up and touch them. The room smells of wood smoke and bean stew and the faint sourness of old ale soaked into the tabletops. A fire burns in a wide hearth at one end, its flames low and steady behind a screen of wrought iron, and the only light comes from that fire and from 2 tallow candles set in clay holders on the mantel. A few tables fill the room, each with a bench on either side, and a handful of travellers are already seated, speaking in soft accents that you do not strain to hear. You find a corner where the light is dimmest, sit with your back to the wall, and order a bowl of the bean stew from the innkeeper's wife, a woman with a calm, unhurried way of moving who brings it to you with a wooden spoon and a thick slice of brown bread. The stew is thick and warm, filled with white beans, shreds of leek, and a piece of smoked pork that falls apart when you touch it with the spoon, and you eat it slowly, while the murmur of the other guests washes around you in waves of sound, too low to separate into words. After the meal you sit for a while longer, your hands wrapped around a cup of ale that you sip without thirst, letting the warmth of the fire reach you across the room. The other travellers seem as tired as you are, their conversations sparse and full of long pauses, and no one looks your way or asks questions. The innkeeper pulls a curtain across the window, and the room darkens to a deeper orange, the shadows pooling in the corners. You feel the weight of the day settling on you, a pleasant heaviness that makes your eyelids want to close, and you decide to find your room. A narrow stair leads up from a door at the back of the inn, and you climb it carefully, your hand on the cold stone wall. At the top is a tiny chamber, hardly larger than the bed it contains, with a single shuttered window that looks out onto the darkening yard. The bed is a wooden frame with a straw mattress and a woolen blanket, and a small stool stands beside it, holding a clay candle holder with a fresh candle. You shut the door, hang your damp cloak on a peg, and sit on the bed to remove your boots. The leather pouch comes off over your head, and you hold it in your hands for a moment, turning it over to check the stitching and the cord. The wax seal is still intact, the twisted linen cord still tight, the letter inside still flat and uncreased. You place the pouch on the stool beside the candle. Then you kneel by the bed and say the simple prayers you've said every night since childhood, the words forming silently on your lips while the inn settles around you with small creaks and the distant murmur of voices below. Then you blow out the candle. The room goes dark and still, and you lie down under the woolen blanket that smells faintly of lavender from the chest where it was stored, waiting for sleep to come. The inn stirred slowly around you in the grey light before dawn, a muffled thump of someone feeding the fire downstairs, the creak of a shutter being opened, the low murmur of the innkeeper's voice speaking to the stable boy in the yard. You woke to these sounds without urgency, lying still under the woolen blanket and watching the pale square of the window grow lighter by degrees. The candle stub on the stool was cold, the leather pouch still beside it where you had placed it the night before, and you reached out to touch the outline of the sealed letter through the leather before sitting up and swinging your feet to the cold floorboards. You dressed in the half-light, pulling on your boots with the practiced motions of many mornings, and fastened the pouch around your neck so that it lay against your chest under the tunic. The room was cold enough that your breath showed faintly, and you rubbed your hands together before lifting your cloak from the peg and swinging it over your shoulders. The wool was still slightly damp from yesterday's rain, but it would dry in the first hour of walking. Downstairs the common room was empty, except for the innkeeper's wife, who had set out a small loaf of bread and a cup of watered ale on the table nearest the hearth. You ate standing, tearing the bread into pieces, and left a copper coin on the table before stepping out into the yard. The morning air was crisp and clean, the sky a pale blue streaked with high clouds that caught the first gold of the sun. The stable boy brought your horse already saddled, and you checked the girth with a tug before mounting. The road away from the inn led past a row of pollarded willows that lined a ditch, their knotted heads sprouting thin wands of new growth, and then it joined the old Roman road again for a short stretch before splitting into two tracks at a stone marker, so old the writing had been worn away by 1,000 rains. You took the left-hand fork, which the map in your memory said led toward the walled market town that you could not easily avoid. The track crossed a wide heath, where gorse bushes grew in dense, dark green mounds dotted with a few late yellow flowers that smelt faintly of coconut when you passed close. Rabbits scattered into their burrows as you approached, white tails flashing, and a kestrel hovered overhead so still it might have been pinned to the sky, its wings making tiny adjustments too quick to follow. The heath gave way to cultivated land, strips of plough turned dark and rich, and then to an area of small enclosures where sheep grazed behind dry stone walls, their faces black and their wool the color of dirty snow. A woman collecting kindling straightened up as you passed and gave you a nod. You returned it and rode on, the town now visible as a low grey line on the horizon. As you drew closer, the line resolved into walls built of the same grey stone as the village houses, crenellated at the top and patched in many places with lighter stone that marked repairs over centuries. A tower gate stood at the nearest point of the wall, its arch tall enough for a loaded cart, and a steady trickle of people was passing through it, peasants carrying baskets of eggs, a man leading a donkey laden with firewood, two women with bundles of washed wool wrapped in cloth. You slowed your horse to a walk and joined the line, keeping your head down just enough to seem unremarkable. The guards at the gate leaned against the stonework, their pikes propped beside them, talking quietly to each other about something that made one of them laugh without much energy. They glanced at you and at the other travelers without interest, and you passed under the arch into the town without a word being spoken. Inside the walls the streets were narrow and shadowed, the upper stories of the houses leaning out so far that the thatched roofs almost touched above the middle of the lane. The morning light fell in bright slashes across the cobbles, where gaps in the buildings allowed it through, and everywhere there was the smell of a town, wood smoke, baking bread, the sharp tang of tanned leather, and under it all, the earthy scent of the midden heaps behind the houses. You dismounted and led your horse by the reins, walking slowly through the streets that twisted and turned without plan, following the general flow of people toward the market square. The market square opened before you suddenly, a wide space surrounded by timber-framed buildings with painted signs hanging above their doors, a boot, a bunch of grapes, a pair of scissors, a loaf of bread. The center of the square was filled with stalls covered by canvas awnings that flapped gently in the breeze, their colors faded to soft browns and grays and the occasional dull red. Sellers called their wares in voices that had long since lost their urgency, repeating the same phrases over and over until the words blurred into the general noise of the crowd. Fresh eggs, onions from the garden, good woolen cloth, salt from the coast, iron nails, wooden spoons. The air was thick with a low chatter of bargaining and the shuffle of feet on packed earth. You tied your horse to a post at the edge of the square where 3 other horses already stood, their noses in feed bags, and you walked into the market slowly, your boots sinking slightly into the mud that the morning traffic had churned up. The first stall you passed sold pottery, bowls and jugs, stacked in careful pyramids, their glazes a simple brown or green. The potter sat on a stool behind his wares, shaping a lump of clay on a small wheel that he turned with his foot, his hands moving in a steady rhythm that did not pause when you looked at his work. You moved on. At the next stall, a baker had set out loaves of different sizes on a wooden board, some round and dark-crusted, others long and dusted with flour. The baker was a round man with flour up to his elbows, and when you pointed to a small round loaf, he took your coin and wrapped the bread in a square of coarse linen with the unhurried care of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times. The loaf was still warm from the oven, and you tucked it into your saddlebag, feeling the heat through the leather. You walked further into the square, past a woman selling onions strung together by their dried stalks, and a man with cages of live chickens that clucked and pecked at the bars. At a stall shaded by a sagging canvas roof, a cheese merchant had arranged wheels of hard cheese in stacks, their rinds the color of old wood, and smaller rounds of soft cheese wrapped in leaves. You chose a wedge of the hard cheese. The merchant cut it with a wire and weighed it in his hand before naming a price, and you added it to your saddlebag beside the bread. A few stalls further on, you found an ironmonger who had laid out his goods on a blanket, nails, hinges, knives, and a small basket of flints for tinder pouches. You picked out a flint that fit neatly into the palm of your hand, dark grey with a sharp edge where it had been napped, and you paid for it with a small coin and slipped it into the pouch at your belt. With your purchases made, you stood for a moment at the edge of the square, letting the life of the town wash around you. A group of children ran past, chasing a dog that had stolen something from a stall, their feet splashing through puddles. A woman argued with a cloth merchant over the price of a length of blue wool, her voice rising and falling in a familiar pattern that neither of them seemed to take seriously. Pigeons cooed from the ledges of the buildings, and the church bell struck the hour of terce, a single deep note that hung in the air and slowly faded. Then you noticed a clerk standing at the far end of the square on a small wooden platform that raised him a few inches above the crowd. He was a thin man in a black robe, and he held a parchment in both hands, from which he read in a droning voice that carried only a little way before the market noise swallowed it. You caught fragments, a proclamation from the English garrison, something about the truce and the movement of goods, a list of taxes due at Michaelmas. No one stopped to listen. The crowd parted around him like water round a stone, and the clerk continued reading to no one in particular, his voice a monotonous thread that ran under the market chatter without interrupting it. You did not pause either. The words meant nothing to you, and you had a letter to deliver. You turned away from the square and led your horse toward the north end of town. The streets leading to the north gate were quieter, the shops here closed or occupied by craftsmen who worked in silence. A cobbler tapping nails into a shoe, a weaver at a loom that clacked softly, a scribe bent over a desk with a quill that scratched across vellum. The north gate was smaller than the south, a simple arch in the wall with a wooden portcullis that was raised and rusted into place. No guard stood here, only an old woman sitting on a stool beside the gate, spinning wool onto a drop spindle that twisted and dropped, in a rhythm so steady it seemed to match your own breathing. She looked up as you passed and smiled a toothless smile, and then you were through the gate and the town was behind you. The road north climbed gently out of the river valley into a region of vineyards that covered the slopes in neat rows. The vines were bare now, their leaves fallen and their branches pruned back to stubby fists that stuck up from the earth at regular intervals. The soil between the rows was a pale, chalky brown, and small stones had been piled at the ends of each row, left there during the last clearing. The vineyard stretched for a mile or more, the rows running straight up and down the slopes, and here and there a wooden stake had been left in the ground, with a scrap of cloth tied to it to scare the birds, though the birds were mostly gone now, and the scraps hung limp and still. You rode between the vineyard rows on a narrow track that the workers used during the harvest, the horses' hooves making a soft crunch on the chalky soil. The sun had climbed higher, and the day had warmed enough that you pushed back your hood and let the light fall on your face. The air here smelled different. Dry earth, the faint sweetness of old grape must from somewhere further up the slope where a press house stood with its door open, a great wooden beam visible inside. A man in a stained tunic was shoveling pomace into a cart, the dark mass of pressed skins and seeds steaming slightly in the cool air, and he paused to watch you pass without raising a hand, then returned to his shoveling. Beyond the vineyards, the land rose into a series of low, rounded hills covered in dry grass that had been cropped short by sheep. The path followed the contour of the hills, winding in long, lazy curves that added distance without effort, and you let the horse choose its own pace on the gentle inclines. The view opened behind you whenever you reached a high point, showing the town as a grey cluster of roofs and walls receding into the haze, the square tower of the church the last thing to fade. Ahead the hills rolled on, one after another, each one slightly different from the last, one with a copse of twisted oaks at its crown, another with a ruined shepherd's hut whose roof had fallen in, a third with a single standing stone that you could not remember from the map, and that had no obvious purpose, placed there by people older than the Romans and left to weather the centuries alone. As the afternoon wore on, the sky cleared to a deep, cloudless blue, and the light turned the colour of honey, long and golden and warm on your shoulders. The shadows of the horse and rider stretched out far to the side, moving over the grass like silent companions. You passed through a shallow valley where a stream ran along a bed of grey pebbles, and you stopped to let the horse drink and to fill your water bottle from the cold flow. The stream was narrow enough to step across, its banks lined with watercress that grew thick and green, and you picked a few leaves and ate them, the peppery taste sharp on your tongue. Then you mounted again and continued north as the sun began its slow descent toward the ridge of hills behind you. In the last hour of daylight, the path led you into a wide, flat area of harvested hayfields where the grass had been cut and gathered into great hayricks that stood at intervals across the field like small thatched houses. The hayricks were built around central poles, their sides sloping steeply so that the rain would run off, and they smelled strongly of dried grass and clover, a scent that reminded you of the barn where you had slept 2 nights before. You chose a hayrick on the eastern edge of the field, set slightly apart from the others and backed by a low hedge that would shelter you from any night wind. There you dismounted, loosened the horse's girth, and tied it to a stake you drove into the ground and pulled several armfuls of loose hay from the outer layer of the rick to make a bed at its base. The sun set while you worked, the sky turning from gold to amber to a deep, clear violet in which the first stars appeared one by one, faint and steady. You sat with your back against the hayrick and ate a supper of bread and cheese, washing it down with water from your bottle, while the horse cropped the short grass nearby with a sound like cloth being torn. The letter pouch you checked by habit, the wax seal still whole, the cord still tight, and you tucked it back under your tunic, where your body heat would keep it warm. The air cooled quickly after sunset, and you wrapped your cloak around yourself and lay down in the hollow of hay you had made. Above you the stars multiplied until the whole sky was dusted with light, and you watched them for a long time, picking out the constellations your father had taught you, the plough, the hunter, the great bear, turning slowly around the pole star. The hay rustled beneath you as you settled, and the horse shifted its weight and snorted once, then stood still. The night was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, and after a while even that faded, and you slept under the open sky with the letter safe against your chest. You woke to a world coated in heavy dew, the hayrick's outer layer glistening with droplets that caught the first pale light and held it like tiny glass beads. Your cloak was damp on the outside but dry within, and the horse stood with its head drooping, its mane tangled with bits of hay and sparkling with moisture. The sky was a soft, milky blue, cloudless but holding a haze that promised a still day. You ate the last of yesterday's bread without rising, sitting in the hollow of hay and letting the morning fill your senses. The smell of wet grass, the distant crow of a rooster from a farm you could not see, the slow, steady chewing of your horse breaking its own fast on the dewy turf. Then you stood, shook out your cloak, and saddled the horse with movements that were becoming so familiar they required no thought, your hands finding the buckles and straps on their own. You rode north, through the last of the hayfields, while the dew soaked your boots and the horses' fetlocks, leaving a dark trail in the silvered grass. The land rose slightly, then dipped into a shallow bowl where a line of trees stood dark and dense against the pale sky. This was the forest your map had called merely the woodland of thorns, and as you approached you saw why. The edge of it was a tangle of blackberry thickets, so dense they formed a wall higher than your head, their canes arching and interlocking, studded with curved thorns that caught the light. A narrow opening appeared where the track entered, just wide enough for a single horse, and you ducked your head and passed inside. The change was immediate and complete. The open sky vanished, replaced by a ceiling of interwoven branches that filtered the daylight into a dim, greenish glow. The air grew cooler and stiller, heavy with the smell of damp earth, rotting wood, and the faint sweetness of unseen fungi. The track narrowed to a single file between blackberry thickets and ancient oaks whose trunks were so wide you could not have reached around them, their bark deeply furrowed and covered in patches of grey-green lichen that spread like old stains. Moss grew thickly on every surface that did not move, cushioning the roots, climbing the lower trunks, softening the shapes of fallen logs until they looked like sleeping animals. The only sound was the slow creak of saddle leather, a rhythmic whisper that matched the horse's steady walk, and the occasional rustle of a bird in the undergrowth that never showed itself. You let the horse choose its pace, the reins slack in your hands, because the path allowed no other choice. It twisted and turned among the trunks, sometimes disappearing under a drift of last year's leaves, only to reappear on the far side of a fallen branch. The leaves underfoot were deep and soft, muffling the hoofbeats to a dull thud that seemed to come from very far away, and the horse moved through them with a patient, careful step, its ears flicking forward and back as it listened to the forest. Mushrooms pushed up through the moss in clusters. Some were pale and slender, others broad and brown with gills that showed like pages of a tiny book, and a few were bright orange, their caps curled upward like shallow cups filled with rainwater from the night's dew. You noticed them without stopping, your eye catching their quiet shapes as you passed, and then they receded into the dimness behind you. A spider's web stretched between two saplings, its silk beaded with moisture. The spider itself a tiny brown knot at the center, waiting without movement. The forest was not silent. It was filled with small, continuous sounds that blended into a low, constant hum. The drip of water from leaves, the creak of branches rubbing together high above, the faint scuttle of something small in the leaf litter. After a time the path forked, two faint trails diverging between the oaks with no marker to indicate which was the true way. You reined the horse to a stop and sat for a moment, listening to the silence that rushed in to fill the space the hoofbeats had left. Then you saw it, a blaze cut into the bark of an old oak, a simple mark shaped like an arrowhead, its edges swollen with age and darkened by sap, but still visible. Someone long ago had walked this way with a knife and left directions, and you followed the mark down the left-hand fork, watching for the next blaze as the path wound deeper into the wood. The blazes appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes on oaks, sometimes on beeches whose smooth grey bark had healed around the cuts, making them look like old scars. Each time you spotted one you felt a small, quiet reassurance that passed as quickly as it came, and you continued without altering your pace. The forest floor rose and fell in gentle undulations, crossing the dry beds of winter streams where rounded stones lay scattered among the roots, and once you passed under a huge fallen trunk that had been propped up by its own branches so that it formed a low arch over the path, its underside thick with bracket fungi that jutted out like shelves of old leather. In the deepest part of the wood, the light was so dim that the green of the moss turned almost grey, and the air grew damp enough that you could feel it on your cheeks, cool and soft as a breath. You heard a woodpecker somewhere far off, its tapping a single repeated note that stopped and started, until it stopped altogether and did not resume. The horse walked on, its head nodding with each step, and you let your own head bow slightly, your eyes half closing, so that the forest became a blur of green and brown, a steady passage of trunks that seemed to repeat endlessly. At midday, the trees thinned slightly, and the path opened into a small clearing where the sun fell in a single bright shaft, illuminating a charcoal burner's camp. You saw the mounds first, low domes of earth and turf that smoked gently from vents at their tops. The smoke, a thin blue-white that rose straight up and vanished into the canopy. Around the mounds, the ground was bare and blackened, swept clean of leaves, and tools lay in tidy order: a long-handled rake, a shovel with a worn blade, a pile of cut logs stacked in a careful pyramid. The air here smelled of smoke and hot earth, a dry, acrid scent that caught in your throat, and you could hear the soft hiss of the fires smouldering inside the mounds, a sound like distant rain. The charcoal burner himself sat against a log at the edge of the clearing, his back to the rough bark, his head fallen forward so that his chin rested on his chest. His hands lay open in his lap, the palms black with charcoal dust, and his breathing was slow and deep, the rhythm of someone who had been sleeping for hours, and would sleep for hours more. A clay bottle stood beside him, and a crust of bread on a cloth, and a small fire pit with cold ashes where he had cooked his last meal. You rode past him at a walk, the horse stepping carefully around the edge of the clearing so as not to disturb the swept ground, and the burner did not stir, his sleep undisturbed by your passage. Beyond the clearing the path resumed its narrow course through the trees, and you looked back once to see the smoke still rising straight and the man still motionless against his log, the whole scene as still as a painting. Then the forest closed around you again, and the green dimness returned, and you continued following the blazes that appeared now on silver birches, whose white bark made the old scars easier to spot. The path crossed a brook where water ran over a bed of dark pebbles, and the horse paused to drink without being asked, lowering its head and sucking the water in long, slow draughts while you sat and watched the light ripple on the surface. In the afternoon the quality of the light began to change, the green growing paler and the shadows less deep, and you sensed that the forest was thinning even before you could see the edge. The undergrowth became sparser, the blackberry thickets giving way to ferns that grew in feathery clumps, their fronds still tightly curled at the tips. The path widened slightly, and the trees stood further apart, allowing more sky to show through the gaps, a sky that had turned a soft, hazy gold as the sun began its descent. The horse seemed to sense the change too. Its pace quickened slightly, and you let it walk on without restraint, your body swaying with emotion. Then, quite suddenly, the trees ended, and you emerged onto a heath where the horizon opened wide under a lavender sky. The transition was so abrupt that you reined the horse to a stop for a moment, blinking in the light that seemed dazzling after the dimness of the wood. The heath stretched before you in a broad, open sweep, its surface a patchwork of heather, gorse, and coarse grass that rippled in the breeze like the pelt of some great animal. The colours were muted, the deep purple-brown of old heather, the dark green of gorse, the pale straw of bent grasses, all blending into a soft, hazy carpet that rolled gently toward distant hills. The sky above was a pale lavender that deepened toward the east where the sun was sinking, and a few high clouds caught the last light in streaks of rose and gold. The path continued across the heath as a faint track of packed sand that wound between the heather clumps, and you followed it while the breeze freshened, carrying the clean, sharp scent of the open moor. The horse stepped more lightly here, glad perhaps to be free of the close trees, and you felt your own spirits lift slightly without any particular reason, simply the effect of space and light after the long hours in the forest. A curlew called somewhere out on the heath, a long bubbling note that rose and fell, and you watched the bird lift from the ground and fly with slow, deliberate wing beats toward the hills. As dusk gathered, the lavender sky deepened to a soft violet, and you began to look for shelter, scanning the heath for any sign of a dwelling. The map in your memory had marked a shepherd's bothy somewhere on this stretch, and you found it at last in a shallow hollow where the ground dipped toward a small dark tarn. The bothy was a simple stone hut with a turf roof from which grass and heather grew as thickly as on the surrounding moor, making it almost invisible until you were nearly upon it. The door was a rough plank hanging on leather hinges, and it stood slightly ajar, the opening dark and silent. You dismounted and pushed the door open, and the inside was a single small room with a beaten earth floor and a hearthstone at one end under a smoke hole in the roof. A wooden platform covered with dry heather served as a bed, and a three-legged stool sat beside the cold hearth. The air smelled of old peat smoke and dry earth, not unpleasantly, and the walls were thick enough to hold the day's warmth. You led the horse to the lee of the hut where a low stone wall formed a small enclosure, and you tied it there with enough rain to graze the short grass, leaving a pile of the dry heather within its reach. Then you carried your saddlebags inside and shut the door against the cooling evening. You ate a small supper of cheese and the last of a hard sausage you had bought in the market town, sitting on the stool with your back to the wall while the light through the smoke hole faded from violet to deep blue. The wind had risen slightly, and it moved through the heather outside with a soft, continuous sigh, a sound like the sea very far away, or like the breath of someone sleeping in the next room. The bothy creaked once, settling on its stones, and a tiny spider lowered itself from the roof beam on a thread so fine you could see it only when it caught the last light. You checked the leather pouch as you did every night, finding the seal whole and the cord tight, and then you lay down on the heather bed, pulling your cloak over you like a blanket. The heather was springy and smelled of the moor, and you shifted until you found a hollow that fit your shoulder and hip. Through the smoke hole you could see a single star, very bright and steady, and you watched it while the wind continued its slow movement through the heather, a sound without beginning or end. The horse stamped once outside, and then was still. The star blurred again, and you let your eyes close while the soft sigh of the moor wrapped around the bothy and held it, and you in a quiet that went on until there was nothing left but the wind and the dark and the slow, gentle pull of sleep. You woke in the shepherd's bothy to a silence so complete it seemed the moor itself was holding its breath. The wind had died in the night, and the heather outside stood still and dripping, each tiny bell-shaped flower holding a bead of moisture from the mist that had rolled in before dawn. The smoke hole above showed a circle of pale grey sky, and the air inside the hut was cold and clean, smelling of dry peat and the faint honeyed scent of old heather. You lay still for a few minutes, letting the silence settle around you like a blanket, then rose and pushed open the creaking door. The world outside was soft and blurred, the heath transformed by a low mist that lay in the hollows like pools of milk. The tarn below the bothy was invisible, its surface hidden under a layer of white vapour that moved very slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting and folding back on itself. Your horse stood in the stone enclosure with its head raised, ears pricked toward you, and when you approached it, blew a soft breath through its nostrils that steamed in the cold air. You saddled it, while the mist began to thin in patches, revealing glimpses of the track ahead, and then you mounted and rode away from the bothy, without looking back, the hut already fading into the grey behind you. The track across the heath was damp and springy underfoot, the sand packed hard by centuries of feet and hooves, but softened on top by the night's moisture. You rode slowly, letting the horse find its own way through the mist that still clung to the lower ground, parting around you like water and closing again behind. The heather brushed against your boots with a soft, wet whisper, and once a grouse burst from a clump almost under the horse's nose, its wings beating a rapid thrum that faded quickly into the grey. The horse shied slightly, but you calmed it with a word and continued, watching the mist grow thinner and brighter as the sun climbed behind the clouds. By the time you reached the edge of the heath, the mist had burned away entirely, revealing a landscape of gentle green slopes that rolled down toward a broad river valley. The river itself appeared as a silver thread winding through the bottom lands, its course marked by a line of willows and alders, whose bare branches traced a dark scribble against the pale sky. You could see, far to the east, the grey smudge of a stone bridge with a tower at its centre, but your map had warned against that crossing. It was held by a garrison, and even under truce you preferred to avoid questions. Instead, you turned the horse westward along the high ground above the valley, following a track that descended slowly toward a remembered point on the map, a ferry crossing marked by a small hut and a flat barge. The descent took nearly an hour, the path winding in long switchbacks through slopes covered in rough pasture, where sheep grazed and raised their heads to watch you pass with their strange, horizontal pupilled eyes. The grass was short and neat, cropped close by the flocks, and dotted here and there with the dark green rosettes of thistles that had not yet flowered. The river grew larger as you descended, its surface catching the light in 1,000 tiny flashes, and you began to hear its voice, not loud, but a constant low murmur that underlay the bird song and the breeze, a sound like a conversation heard through a wall. At the bottom of the slope the track levelled out and ran along the river bank through a strip of meadow where the grass grew longer and was still wet with dew, soaking your horse's legs to the knees. The river here was broad and slow, its water the colour of green glass, and you could see the sandy bottom sloping away into deeper darkness near the far bank. Willows leaned out over the water, their trailing branches dipping into the current and making small ripples that spread and vanished, and the air smelled of wet stone, crushed mint from the river bank, and the clean, cold breath of moving water. The ferryman's hut appeared around a bend, a small structure of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that had grown a thick coat of moss. A thin thread of smoke rose from a hole in the thatch, and beside the hut a wooden jetty extended into the river, its planks grey and weathered. Tied to the jetty was the barge, a flat, square platform of heavy planks with low sides, big enough to carry a horse and rider, or a small cart, and it floated so steadily on the slow water that it hardly seemed to move at all. A long pole lay along its deck, worn smooth by countless hands, and a rope ran from the barge to a post on the jetty, coiled neatly. You dismounted and called out, and after a moment the ferryman emerged from his hut, a bent old man with a face as creased as the river's surface in a wind. He wore a patched tunic and a leather apron, and he walked with a slight limp, one hand on his lower back as if it pained him. He looked at you, looked at your horse, and nodded once, then walked to the jetty and began untying the rope without speaking. You led the horse onto the barge, the planks booming hollowly under its hooves, and the animal stood quietly as if it had done this many times before. The ferryman cast off and took up his pole, and with a single unhurried push he sent the barge sliding out onto the river. The crossing took nearly an hour, though the river was not wide. The ferryman poled with a slow, steady rhythm, planting the pole in the riverbed and walking from the bow to the stern along a narrow plank, then pulling the pole free and walking back, over and over, his movements so practiced they seemed effortless. The current was gentle here, a slow green glide that carried the barge slightly downstream, even as the ferryman angled it toward the far bank, and you stood beside your horse with one hand on its neck, watching the water slide past. The surface of the river was smooth, except where it swirled around the pole, creating small eddies that spun away and dissolved, and the only sounds were the soft plash of the pole entering the water, the drip of it lifting, and the low creak of the barge's timbers shifting underfoot. A heron stood in the shallows on the far bank, a tall grey statue on stick-thin legs, its long neck folded into an S-curve, and it watched the barge approach without moving, its eye a bright gold bead. When you were 20 yards away, it unfolded itself with a slow, deliberate motion, spread its great wings and lifted into the air with a few heavy beats, its legs trailing behind, and then it was gone, around the bend of the river, and the bank was empty. The ferryman poled on, his face expressionless, his eyes on the water ahead, and you noticed the way the light played on the river's surface, shifting patterns of gold and green that never repeated. When the barge bumped gently against the far jetty, the ferryman looped the rope around a post and stood aside, and you led your horse onto the bank while the old man watched in silence. You paid him with a small silver coin from the purse the clerk in Foix had given you, and he bit it once, nodded, and tucked it into his apron before returning to his hut without a word. The barge sat behind you already forgotten, a simple raft waiting for the next traveller who might come this way, and you mounted your horse and turned to follow the path that the map said would lead you upstream along the river. The path on this side of the river was a soft track that ran beneath a row of old willows, their trunks twisted and split, their bark deeply grooved. The river stayed close on your right hand, always visible through the trailing branches, its murmur a constant companion. The ground here was flatter, the valley floor spreading wide into water meadows, where the grass grew thick and lush, and in the distance you could see the grey shapes of cattle standing motionless in the fields, their heads lower to the grazing. The willows gave way to alders, their roots exposed where the bank had eroded, forming dark, tangled cages that reached into the water. You rode slowly, matching the river's own pace, which was so unhurried that you sometimes could not tell if the water was moving at all, except by watching a drifting leaf or a twig as it floated past. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the air, and the sky had cleared to a soft, cloudless blue, the kind of day that felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed to match the river. Birds sang in the alders, a blackbird's liquid notes falling like water over stones, and somewhere a chiff-chaff repeated its two-note call with a persistence that became, after a while, simply part of the landscape. You came to a gravel beach where the river made a wide bend, a shallow crescent of pale stones that sloped gently into the water. You dismounted and led the horse down to drink, the stones crunching under your boots, and while the horse sucked the cold water, you crouched and dipped your own hands in, cupping them to bring the water to your mouth. It tasted of mountains and rain and the long journey from the high springs where it had begun, cold enough to make your teeth ache. The horse drank its fill and then stood with its muzzle just touching the water, blowing soft bubbles that drifted away, and you gave it a moment of rest before leading it back to the path. As you mounted again, a flash of blue caught your eye, so bright and sudden it seemed like a piece of the sky had fallen. A kingfisher darted out from an overhanging branch and flew low over the water, its wings beating so fast they were a blue blur, its call a single high, sharp note that cut through the river's murmur and was gone. The bird vanished into a hole in the far bank, a dark opening among the roots, and the river returned to its quiet green flow, as if nothing had happened. You sat still for a moment, the image of that bright blue still glowing behind your eyes, and then you clicked your tongue, and the horse walked on. The afternoon passed in a long, slow ribbon of river and willows, and the steady plod of hooves on the soft track. You passed a fisherman sitting on the bank with a line trailing in the water, an old man in a broad-brimmed hat who did not look up as you rode by, and further on, a woman washing clothes at the river's edge, her basket of linen beside her, and the wet cloth spread on the grass to dry. She raised a hand in greeting, and you returned the gesture, and then she was behind you, and the river bent again, and you were alone once more. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, the valley opened out, and you saw, ahead and slightly above the river, the pale stone walls of a small monastery. It stood on a gentle rise among orchards and fish ponds, its buildings arranged around a central cloister that you could glimpse through an archway in the outer wall. The church was the largest structure, a simple rectangular building with a square tower that rose above the rooftops, its bell just visible through the arched openings at the top. The whole place had a settled, peaceful look, as if it had grown out of the hillside rather than been built upon it, and the sound of the bell ringing compline drifted down to you across the orchards, a single deep note that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. You rode up to the gatehouse, a low building with a heavy wooden door that stood open, and a lay brother in a brown habit came out to meet you. He was a young man with a round, calm face and hands that were stained with earth from the garden, and he asked no questions beyond whether you needed lodging for the night. You said you did, and he nodded and led your horse to a small stable while you waited in the gatehouse, looking at the whitewashed walls and the simple wooden cross that hung above the inner door. When he returned, he led you through the cloister, a square of covered walkway around a garden where herbs grew in neat beds, their scents mingling in the still air, rosemary, thyme, lavender, chamomile. The walkway was paved with worn flagstones, and your footsteps echoed softly as you followed the brother to the guest house. The guest house was a small building set apart from the main cloister, with a row of tiny cells each containing a bed, a stool, and a wooden shelf with a candle. The brother opened the door to one of these cells and left you with a quiet word about the hour of supper, and you entered and set your saddlebags on the stool. The cell was whitewashed like the gatehouse, the walls bare except for a small painted panel showing a ship on a calm sea, and the window looked out onto the orchard where the apple trees stood in rows, their branches heavy with the last of the fruit. The light through the window was the color of honey, and you stood for a while watching the shadows of the trees lengthen across the grass. A bell rang softly somewhere in the main building, and you followed its sound to a small refectory where the lay brother who had met you set out a bowl of broth and a piece of coarse bread on a long wooden table. 2 other travellers were already seated, a wool merchant and his son, and they ate in silence, their faces tired from the road. You sat apart from them and ate the broth, which was thin and warm and tasted of leeks and herbs from the garden, and you soaked the bread in it, and ate that too, feeling the warmth spread through you after the long day in the cool air. No one spoke, and the only sounds were the clink of wooden spoons on wooden bowls and the soft footsteps of the brother clearing the table. After supper, you walked back through the cloister as the last light faded, the herb garden now a dark mass of shapes, the stars beginning to appear in the square of sky above the open centre. The bell for Compline had fallen silent, and the monastery had settled into the deep quiet of the night hours, a quiet that seemed to have been here for centuries and would last for centuries more. You found your cell and lit the candle on the shelf, the flame small and steady, and by its light you checked the leather pouch as you did every night. The seal was whole, the cord tight, the letter still flat and dry against your chest, and you placed it on the shelf beside the candle while you removed your boots and cloak. You lay on the bed, which was a simple straw mattress on a wooden frame, covered with a clean woolen blanket that smelled faintly of the lavender from the cloister garden. The candlelight flickered on the whitewashed walls, making the painted ship seem to move on its painted sea, and you watched it while your body slowly relaxed, the tension of the day's ride draining away into the mattress. Outside the window the orchard was dark and still, and somewhere an owl called once, a soft round note that hung in the air and faded. You closed your eyes and listened to the silence, a silence so deep you could hear the faint rush of your own blood, and after a while even that faded, and you slept as the candle burned down and the monastery dreamed around you. You woke in the monastery guest-house to the sound of a single bell ringing the hour of prime, its note so deep and clear it seemed to pass through the whitewashed walls like light through water. The candle on the shelf had burned down to a pool of wax with the wick drowned in it, and the window showed a sky the color of a pearl, pale and lustrous with the first hint of dawn. You lay still, letting the bell's last vibrations fade into silence, then sat up and reached for the leather pouch on the shelf. The seal was whole, the cord tight, the letter inside still flat and dry, and you fastened the pouch around your neck where it settled against your skin with a familiar weight. The lay brother who had welcomed you the night before was already in the refectory, setting out a cup of small ale and a piece of oat bread on the long table. You ate quickly, the bread dense and slightly sweet, and then you walked through the cloister one last time as the herb garden began to emerge from the shadows, the rosemary and thyme releasing their scents as the air warmed. The brother brought your horse to the gatehouse, and you thanked him with a nod. He raised his hand in a blessing or a farewell, and then you were through the gate and riding away from the monastery as the bell began to ring again, marking the next hour with the same steady, unhurried note. The road away from the monastery climbed gently through the orchards, the apple trees still heavy with fruit that hung red and gold against the grey bark. The grass between the trees was wet with dew, and the horses' hooves left dark prints that filled slowly with water. After the orchards, the track passed a series of fish ponds, their surfaces smooth and brown, and you saw the dark shapes of carp moving just below the surface, their wakes spreading in slow V's that overlapped and vanished. A heron stood at the edge of the furthest pond, the same bird perhaps that you had seen at the river, or another exactly like it, and it watched you pass with the same golden, unblinking eye before turning its head away, as if dismissing you. Beyond the fish ponds, the land began to rise, the gentle meadows giving way to steeper slopes covered in rough grass and scattered with loose chunks of white chalk that had weathered out of the soil. The path narrowed to a single track that zigzagged up the hillside, and you let the horse find its own footing, the reins slack in your hands. The climb was steady but not difficult, the kind of ascent that required patience rather than effort, and you settled into the rhythm of it, feeling the horse's shoulders work beneath you, hearing its breath deepen and slow as it adjusted to the grade. Halfway up he paused to let the horse rest, turning in the saddle to look back the way you had come. The river valley lay below you now, a broad green trough with a silver thread of the river winding through it, and you could see the monastery as a pale cluster of roofs among the dark orchards, the square tower of the church rising above the trees with the tiny dark speck of the bell just visible in its arch. A thin mist still clung to the river in patches, and the whole valley had the soft, slightly blurred look of something seen through old glass, peaceful and very far away. You turned back to the path and clicked your tongue, and the horse continued its steady climb. At the top of the rise, the land opened out into a wide expanse of chalk downland that stretched before you in a series of low, rolling waves, the grass short and springy and dotted with tiny blue flowers you did not know the name of. The sky here was enormous, a pale, cloudless dome that seemed to press down on the horizon, and the breeze that met you at the crest was cool and clean, carrying the faint, dry scent of chalk dust and wild thyme. The path now ran straight across the downs, a pale line through the darker grass, and you could see it stretching ahead for a mile or more, rising and falling with the contours of the land. On a ridge to your left, perhaps half a mile away, 3 old windmills stood in a row, their sails turning lazily in the breeze that never seemed to change direction. The mills were built of the same grey stone as every other structure in this region, their towers tapering slightly toward the top, and their wooden sails were patched and weathered, the cloth on their frames a faded brown that had once been white. The sails turned with a slow, continuous motion, each revolution taking long enough that you could count your own breaths between the passing of one arm and the next, and the sound they made carried across the down a low, rhythmic creaking of axles, a sound like old wood shifting in its sleep, repeating over and over without variation. The path ran straight below the windmills, keeping them always in the corner of your eye as you rode, and you found yourself glancing at them regularly, noting the way the sun caught the edge of a sail, the way the shadows of the turning arms swept across the grass, the way the miller's door in the base of the nearest tower stood open, a dark rectangle against the pale stone. A figure appeared in that doorway for a moment, a man in a flower-dusted tunic who looked up at the sky and then went back inside without hurrying, and the sails continued their slow turning, as if they had done so for 1,000 years and would do so for 1,000 more. The grass underfoot was so short and even it might have been cut with shears, and your horse walked over it with a light, springy step, its hooves making a soft swishing sound as they brushed through the stems. The blue flowers were everywhere, tiny things with 5 petals and dark centers, growing so close together that in places the grass seemed tinged with blue. You noticed them without studying them, your eye simply registering the color as it passed, and the breeze stirred them in waves that rippled across the downs like water. A meadow pipit rose from a tussock and flew ahead of you, landing again a few dozen yards further on, and then it rose again and flew again, keeping its distance with a nervous, bobbing flight that you watched without thinking. You had been riding for perhaps an hour across the open down, when a hare burst from a tussock almost under the horse's hooves and bounded away in long, unhurried leaps. The horse startled its head coming up, but you held the rein steady and it calmed at once, and you watched the hare as it ran across the short grass with its great hind legs pushing off, its body stretching and contracting, its long ears laid back flat against its head. The hare ran in a wide curve that took it 100 yards to the left, and then it stopped, sat up on its hind legs and looked back at you with an expression that seemed entirely calm, as if it had merely decided to move for its own reasons and not out of any real alarm. You watched it for a moment, and then it dropped to all fours and continued its unhurried way across the down, eventually disappearing into a dip in the land. The horse resumed its walk, and the path continued straight ahead. The morning passed slowly, the sun climbing to its zenith, and the shadows of the 3 windmills rotating across the grass like the hand of a great, slow clock. You stopped once to eat a piece of oat bread and drink from your water bottle, sitting on a chalk boulder that had been placed beside the path as a marker or a mounting block. The horse grazed while you sat, cropping the short grass with its teeth and moving from one patch to the next with a lazy, drifting progress. The breeze had dropped slightly, and the downs had grown very quiet, the only sounds the creak of the windmill sails far off and the occasional call of a skylark somewhere high above, its song a continuous, silvery stream of notes that fell from the sky like water. In the early afternoon, the land began to slope downward, the path descending gently into a small valley that cut across the downs like a fold in a cloth. The grass gave way to rougher ground, patches of nettle and dock appearing among the turf, and you passed a stand of elders whose branches were heavy with clusters of small black berries that the birds had not yet eaten. The air here was warmer and stiller, trapped by the valley walls, and a new smell began to reach you. A sharp, earthy scent of oak bark and animal hide that grew stronger as you descended. The valley floor held a village clustered around a tanner's yard, and you saw the yard before you saw the houses, a wide open area of packed earth where wooden frames stood in rows, hides stretched across them to dry. The hides were in various stages of processing, some pale and stiff, others dark and supple, and the air was thick with the smell of tannin and lime and the faint, sweet undertone of the oak bark that was piled in great heaps at the edge of the yard. Men moved among the frames, their hands and aprons stained dark brown, and they worked in the slow, methodical way of people whose tasks could not be hurried. One man was scraping a hide with a curved knife, the blade making a soft, rhythmic scratching sound, while another stirred a vat of dark liquid with a long wooden paddle, the motion so steady it seemed to match the turning of the windmill sails you had left behind on the downs. The village itself was a single street of stone houses with roofs of heavy slate and a small church at the far end whose bell tower was so low it barely cleared the rooftops. You rode slowly down the street, past a woman drawing water from a well and a child rolling a wooden hoop with a stick, the hoop clattering on the cobbles, and you heard the sound of a smithy somewhere nearby, the ring of a hammer on iron, a sound that rose and fell in an irregular rhythm. At the end of the street you found a house with a painted sign that showed a bed, and beside it a stable with a half door, and a pile of fresh straw visible inside. The widow who kept the house came out when you dismounted, a tall woman in a plain grey dress with a woolen shawl pulled around her shoulders despite the warmth of the afternoon. She had a calm, unhurried way about her, and she named a price for the stable and a room without bargaining. You agreed, and she led your horse into the stable, while you stood in the street, listening to the sound of the fulling stock somewhere downstream, a faint, rhythmic thump that repeated every few seconds, a sound like a heavy footstep on wet ground. The widow returned and led you into the house through a low-ceilinged kitchen where a fire burned in a small hearth and a pot of something savoury simmered over the coals, and up a narrow stair to a spare room under the eaves. The room was small and clean, with a bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a clay basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the back garden toward the stream where the fulling stocks were working. You set your saddlebags on the floor and poured water from the pitcher into the basin, washing your face and hands while the cool water turned grey with the dust of the downs. The widow left you with a quiet word about supper, and you sat on the bed for a moment, feeling the tiredness of the long ride settling into your legs. Through the window the sound of the fulling stocks came clearly, a low, dull thump that repeated every few seconds, followed by a pause, then another thump. The rhythm was irregular, but predictable, like the heartbeat of some large, slow animal, and you lay back on the bed to listen to it. The quilt smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender, and the pillow was stuffed with goose feathers that rustled when you moved your head. You checked the leather pouch by habit, finding the seal still whole and the cord still tight, and then you closed your eyes and let the sound of the fulling stocks wash over you, the thump and pause, a pattern that your breathing gradually began to match. Supper was a bowl of pottage brought to your room by the widow, thick with barley and bits of salted pork, and a cup of small ale that you drank slowly while the light outside the window deepened to orange and then to grey. The fulling stocks continued their rhythmic work, the thump now seeming louder in the evening quiet, and you watched the first stars appear above the dark line of the downs while you finished your meal. The widow came to take the bowl and asked no questions, and you asked none in return, and when she left you heard her footsteps on the stair, the soft closing of a door below, and then only the thump of the fulling stocks and the occasional creak of the house settling on its stones. You undressed in the dim light, placing your tunic and boots on the stool by the bed, and you lay down with the quilt pulled up to your chin. The fulling stocks thumped on, a sound so steady and so monotonous that after a while you ceased to notice it. It became part of the silence, a background rhythm that your mind stopped registering even as your ears continued to hear it. The bed was soft and the night was cool, and the letter lay safe in its pouch on the stool beside you, as it had every night since Foix. You thought of the windmills still turning on the downs above the valley, their sails creaking in the dark, and of the hare somewhere in its form, and of the river sliding past the monastery. And then the thoughts faded one by one, and you slept deeply while the fulling stocks beat their slow, endless cadence through the quiet hours. You woke in the widow's spare room to a morning so still that the fulling stocks downstream had stopped their rhythmic thumping, leaving a silence that felt thick and soft, like a held breath. The window above the bed showed a sky of pale grey that was slowly brightening toward white, and the air in the room was cool but not cold, carrying the faint, clean smell of the chalk downs mixed with the sharper scent of wood smoke from the kitchen below. You lay under the patchwork quilt for a few minutes, listening to the quiet sounds of the widow moving about her morning tasks, the clink of a pot, the scrape of a hearthstone, the low murmur of a voice speaking to the cat. Then you sat up, checked the leather pouch as you did every morning, and began to dress. Downstairs, the widow had set out a cup of warm milk and a small loaf of bread on the kitchen table, and you ate, standing by the hearth while she went to fetch your horse from the stable. The fire was newly lit, the flame still small and blue at the base, and the cat sat on the stool by the hearth washing its face with a slow, meticulous paw. You finished the bread and milk, left a coin on the table, and went out into the yard where the widow held your horse by the bridle, its breath steaming in the cool air. He thanked her with a nod, mounted, and rode out of the village while the sun began to break through the overcast, casting long pale shadows across the street. The road out of the valley climbed gently back onto the downs, but the land here was different. The open grassland gave way to a patchwork of small fields bordered by hedgerows of hawthorn and blackthorn, their bare twigs studded with the first tiny buds of spring. The fields were mostly fallow, their furrows filled with last year's stubble, and here and there a lone oak stood in the middle of a field, its branches still bare but holding the dark shapes of old birds' nests. The air was mild and slightly damp, carrying the earthy smell of turned soil from somewhere nearby where a farmer was already at work, though you never saw him. You rode for 2 hours through this gentle, enclosed country, the path winding between the hedgerows in long, lazy curves that made the journey feel unhurried, as if the road itself was in no rush to reach its destination. Birds sang in the hedges, a blackbird's fluted notes and the repetitive call of a chaffinch, and once a fox crossed the path ahead of you, a lean, red shape that paused to look at you with calm, amber eyes before slipping through a gap in the hedge and vanishing. The horse did not startle. It had seen the fox before you did, and it simply walked on with its steady, patient gait. By late morning, the enclosed fields began to thin out, and the land opened into a broader valley where you could see the line of the main road ahead, a wide, pale track that ran straight as a rule across the landscape. Traffic moved on it, a cart loaded with wool bales, a group of travellers on foot carrying bundles on sticks over their shoulders, a lone horseman riding south. You joined the road at a junction marked by a weathered stone cross, its arms broken off short so that it looked like a rough pillar, and you turned north onto the wide, packed surface that would lead you to the stone bridge. The road was busy enough that you were not alone for long. A wool merchant overtook you on a heavy bay horse, his saddlebags bulging with samples, and he gave you a brief nod as he passed. Behind him came a monk, leading a donkey laden with panniers from which the necks of clay bottles poked out, and the monk walked with a slow, steady pace, his sandals slapping softly on the packed earth. Further back, you could see a woman driving a small flock of geese in wicker cages loaded onto a handcart, the geese honking softly and poking their heads through the bars, and she pushed the cart with a patience, rolling gait that suggested she had been pushing it for many miles and would push it for many more. You fell into the rhythm of the road, matching your pace to the general flow, and you rode with the small company of travelers as the morning wore on toward midday. The bridge appeared first as a grey line across the valley, then as a series of arches, and finally as a great stone structure that spanned the river with the solid, permanent look of something that had been there before anyone could remember. It was built of massive blocks of dressed stone, their surfaces weathered and pitted by centuries of wind and rain, and the piers that supported the arches were thick and buttressed, their bases green with moss and dark with the water stains of countless floods. The river below ran wide and milky, its water the color of pale jade from the glacial silt it carried down from the high mountains, and it moved with the slow, powerful current that swirled around the piers in silent eddies. At the near end of the bridge stood a small toll house, a square stone building with a slate roof and a single window that looked out onto the road. A wooden bar blocked the entrance to the bridge, but it was raised now, and beside it 2 guards leaned against the parapet, with the relaxed posture of men who had been on duty for hours and expected nothing to happen. They had propped their pikes against the stonework, and between them on a barrel they had spread a cloth and were dicing, the little bone cubes rattling in a wooden cup and spilling out with soft clicks. One guard was young, with a sparse beard and a lazy eye that drifted slightly, and the other was older, his face creased and weathered, and they played their game with the slow concentration of men who had nothing else to do and no reason to hurry. You approached the bridge with the wool merchant just ahead of you, and the monk and his donkey just behind. The wool merchant reached the guards first, and he reined in his horse and produced a folded paper from his pouch, holding it out with the air of someone who had done this many times. The older guard glanced at the paper, nodded, and waved him through without a word, and the wool merchant rode onto the bridge and was soon lost beyond the first arch. The monk came next, leading his donkey, and the guards did not even ask for his papers. They simply looked at his habit and his tonsured head and waved him through as well. Then it was your turn. You reined in your horse and reached into the pouch at your belt, drawing out the simple merchant's pass that the clerk in Foix had prepared for you. It was a single sheet of parchment folded in thirds, sealed with a small blob of wax that bore no mark, and the writing inside was in a clerk's neat hand, describing you as a trader in wool traveling north on business. You held it out to the older guard, who took it with the same unhurried motion he had used for the merchant's paper. He unfolded it, squinted at the writing for a moment without much interest, and then folded it again and handed it back. The younger guard did not even look up from the dice. The older guard nodded toward the bridge and said something in a low, flat voice that might have been pass or might have been simply an acknowledgement of your existence, and you rode past them onto the bridge without another word. The bridge was long enough that you could feel the space opening around you, the river wide below and the sky wide above, and the sound of your horse's hooves on the stone echoed between the low parapets with a hollow, ringing quality. You slowed to a walk, letting the horse find its footing on the uneven surface, and you looked out over the parapet at the river below. The water was the color of milky tea, thick with the fine silt that gave it that strange, opaque beauty, and it moved past the piers in smooth, silent sheets that broke into ripples only where they met the stone. A cormorant sat on a rock in the middle of the river, its wings spread wide to dry, and it watched you pass with the same black, incurious eye that all water birds seem to share. At the highest point of the bridge you paused and looked back the way you had come, seeing the road stretch away across the valley, the small figures of the woman with the geese just now approaching the guards, and beyond her the grey line of the downs where the 3 windmills stood, their sails still turning slowly against the pale sky. Then you looked ahead to the far side, where the road disappeared into a region of small enclosed fields bordered by dry stone walls, a landscape of tiny green compartments that climbed the gentle slopes beyond the river. The bridge felt like a threshold, a line between one country and another, though the land on both sides looked much the same. You clicked your tongue and the horse walked on, its hooves ringing on the stones until at last you reached the far end and stepped onto solid ground again. You did not stay on the main road. The map in your memory had been clear. The main road led to a garrison town where questions might be asked and passes examined more carefully, and you had no desire to test the patience of bored soldiers. Instead, you turned off at the first sidetrack beyond the bridge, a narrow lane that ran between two dry stone walls so high you could not see over them. The lane was sunken, the ground worn down by centuries of use, so that the walls rose above your head on either side, their stones covered in grey-green lichen and cushions of dark moss. The horse's hooves made a soft, muffled sound on the grassy track, and the high walls blocked the breeze, so that the air here was still and slightly warmer than on the bridge. The lane wound through a region of tiny fields, each one no larger than a cottage garden, separated by walls of the same grey stone. Some of the fields held sheep, their fleeces marked with splashes of red ochre to show ownership, and others were planted with winter wheat that grew in neat green rows. You passed a field where a man was repairing a gap in the wall, lifting stones one by one and fitting them into place with the slow care of someone who would never be finished, because the walls always needed mending and always would. He looked up as you passed and raised a hand, and you raised yours in return, and then the lane bent and he was gone. The afternoon passed in a long, slow progress through this quiet country, the lane branching and rebranching so that you had to consult the memory of your map at every junction. You took left turns and right turns without hurry, sometimes doubling back when a lane ended at a farm gate, and you noticed that the land was rising almost imperceptibly, the fields becoming smaller and the walls more numerous as you climbed toward the low hills that marked the northern edge of the valley. The sun moved across the sky and began its slow descent, the light turning from white to gold, and the shadows of the walls stretched out across the fields in long dark stripes. As dusk gathered, you found yourself in a region of scattered farmsteads, each one set in its own cluster of fields and orchards, their chimneys sending up thin threads of smoke that rose straight in the still evening air. The light was fading to a soft violet, and you began to look for shelter, knowing that the next village was too far to reach before full dark. You rode up to a farmhouse that stood at the end of a short lane, its walls of grey stone and its roof of heavy thatch, and a dog ran out to meet you, barking once before wagging its tail and circling your horse with a friendly, curious air. The farmer came to the door, a broad man with a beard the colour of iron, and behind him you could see the warm glow of a hearth and the shapes of children peering out. He looked at you, looked at your tired horse, and asked no questions beyond whether you needed a place to sleep. You said you did, and he nodded and showed you to a small stable where you could put your horse, a low building with 2 cows already in their stalls and a pile of fresh hay in the corner. You unsaddled the horse, rubbed it down with a handful of straw, and left it with a feed of oats the farmer had provided, and then you followed the man into the house. The main room of the farmhouse was warm and dim, lit only by the fire in the great hearth and the single tallow candle on the mantel. The floor was of packed earth, swept clean, and the walls were hung with bundles of dried herbs that gave off a faint, sweet smell. A long wooden table stood in the centre, and benches ran along the walls, and the farmer's wife was stirring a pot over the fire, a thin, tired woman with a kind face who smiled at you and said nothing. The children, 3 of them, sat on a bench by the hearth, staring at you with the open curiosity of the young, until their mother shooed them away. The farmer gestured to a bench near the fire, and you sat down, grateful for the warmth after the long day and the cool air. The wife brought you a bowl of stew, thick with root vegetables and shreds of mutton, and a piece of dark bread to sop it up, and you ate slowly while the family went about their evening routines around you. The children were put to bed in a loft above, their footsteps thumping on the boards, and the farmer sat at the table mending a leather strap with an awl and thread, his fingers moving with a slow, practiced skill. The wife spun wool on a drop spindle, the weight twisting and dropping in a rhythm so steady it seemed to measure the heartbeat of the house. When the stew was finished and the bowl taken away, the farmer pointed to a bench against the wall near the hearth, a wide wooden bench with a sheepskin thrown over it, and you understood that this was your bed. You stretched out on it with your cloak as a blanket, and the warmth of the fire reached you in waves, the embers glowing red and gold under the ash. The farmer and his wife went to their own bed in a room off to the side, and the house settled into silence except for the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the cat that moved through the shadows. The cat found you after a while, a small grey creature with white paws, and it jumped onto the bench and settled on your feet with a slow circular motion before curling into a tight ball. Its weight was slight but warm, and you could feel the vibration of its purr through the sheepskin, a low, continuous hum that seemed to blend with the crackle of the embers. You checked the leather pouch one last time, feeling the shape of the seal through the leather, and then you closed your eyes and let the warmth of the fire and the weight of the cat and the deep quiet of the farmhouse pull you gently towards sleep. The embers shifted once, sending up a brief shower of sparks, and then the room was still and dark, and you were gone. You left the farmhouse before first light, moving quietly so as not to wake the family. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of white ash with a single ember still glowing at its heart, and the grey cat that had slept on your feet all night blinked once and rearranged itself on the warm bench as you stood. The farmer's wife had left a small cloth bundle on the table, a piece of oat bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and 2 dried apples, enough for a day's riding. You added these to your saddlebag and stepped out into the yard, where the air was cold and still and the sky was just beginning to pale above the eastern hills. The horse stood in the stable with its head over the half-door, and you saddled it by feel in the dimness, working the buckles with fingers that were still stiff from sleep. The 2 cows watched you with their large dark eyes, chewing slowly, their breath rising in faint clouds. When you were ready, you led the horse out into the lane, mounted, and turned north along a track that climbed away from the farmstead between 2 low stone walls, the same walls you had followed the evening before, their stones now glistening with dew. For the first hour, the track rose gently through a region of small pastures and abandoned sheepfolds, the grass growing longer and rougher as the cultivated land fell behind. The sky brightened from grey to pearl, and then to a pale, watery blue that held no warmth, and you began to see ahead of you a long, dark line of higher ground, a plateau that stretched across the horizon like a great wall. The map in your memory called it simply the High Country, and it was the last real barrier between you and the Valley of Cluny. You rode toward it with the steady, patient pace that had carried you through all the days before, and by mid-morning you had reached the foot of the slope where the climb began. The ascent was steeper than anything you had ridden since leaving Foix, the track narrowing to a single file that zigzagged up the face of the escarpment to a jumble of broken limestone. The horse picked its way with care, its hooves striking sparks from the loose stones, and you leaned forward in the saddle to ease its work, one hand resting on its neck to feel the steady rhythm of its effort. The air grew cooler as you climbed, and a breeze began to stir, carrying the dry, clean scent of stone and the faint, peppery smell of wild thyme that grew in the cracks. The valley below receded, its patchwork fields and dark hedgerows becoming a flat, toy-like landscape that seemed very far away and no longer quite real. As you neared the top, the breeze dropped and the world began to change. The first wisps of mist appeared, drifting across the track like slow ghosts, and within 100 yards they thickened into a dense white fog that closed around you so completely that you could see no more than a few feet in any direction. The horse slowed to a walk, and you let it, trusting its feet where your own eyes could not help. The mist was wet and cool on your face, and it muffled every sound so that the crunch of the horse's hooves on the path seemed to come from very far away, absorbed by the soft white blanket that wrapped the plateau. You walked beside the horse more than you rode, your hand on the bridle and the other reaching out to touch the cairns that suddenly loomed out of the fog. These cairns were old, built of flat stones piled one on top of another, their surfaces covered in grey-green lichen and their bases buried in the coarse grass. They marked the shepherd's track that crossed the plateau, and you knew from the map that if you kept them always on your left hand you would stay on the path. The stones were cold and rough under your palm, and you passed from one cairn to the next with a slow, blind patience, counting your steps between them without meaning to, letting the numbers drift away as soon as they formed. The mist had a way of playing tricks with distance and time. The tracks seemed to stretch and contract, and you could not tell if you'd been walking for minutes or hours. Sometimes the fog would thin for a moment and you would glimpse a wider view, a slope of tumbled boulders, a patch of pale grass, the dark shape of a single stunted tree. Then it would thicken again, and the world would shrink to the small circle of your own footsteps and the horse's steady breath beside you. The silence was immense, broken only by the soft tap of the horse's hooves and the faint, mournful call of a golden plover somewhere out in the mist, a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. After what felt like a very long time, the mist began to lighten, not dissipating but growing brighter, as if the sun was trying to burn through from above. The white turned to a luminous grey and then to a pale silvery glow that made the droplets on your cloak sparkle. You could see the next cairn more clearly now, its stones distinct, and the one after that, and then, quite suddenly, you walked out of the mist as if passing through a curtain into a different world. The plateau revealed itself all at once, a broad, golden grassland that stretched away in every direction under a sky of deep, cloudless blue. The sun was warm on your shoulders, and the grass, cropped short by generations of sheep, rippled in the breeze like the surface of a calm sea. There were no trees here, no walls, no houses, nothing but the open grassland and the occasional outcrop of grey limestone that jutted from the turf like the bones of the earth. The track ran straight across it, a pale line through the gold, and the cairns continued at wider intervals now, no longer needed as guides but still standing, as they had stood for 1,000 years, marking a way that had been old when the Romans came. You mounted again and rode out onto the plateau, the horse seeming to welcome the open ground after the close grip of the fog. Its pace quickened slightly, and you let it move at its own speed, feeling the sun dry the moisture from your cloak and warm the skin of your face. The air here was thin and clear, and you could see for miles in every direction, the plateau rolling gently toward distant hills that were blue with distance. Far to the east, a pair of ravens tumbled in the air, their harsh calls carrying across the grassland, and above them a buzzard circled slowly on a thermal, its wings held wide and still. You rode for a long while across the grassland, the track so straight and true that you hardly needed to guide the horse at all. The sun climbed to its zenith and then began its slow descent, the light shifting from white to gold to a warm honeyed amber that made the limestone outcrops glow. You passed a ring of old stones, a circle no taller than your knee and grown over with moss, placed there by people whose names and language were long forgotten, and you rode by it without stopping, though you glanced at it and wondered briefly at the hands that had set it there. Then it was behind you, another marker on a landscape full of markers, and the track went on. In the middle of the afternoon you stopped for a long rest, choosing a spot where a low outcrop of limestone offered a sheltered hollow out of the breeze. You dismounted and let the horse graze, watching it move slowly across the grass with its head down, its tail swishing lazily at flies that were not there. You sat with your back against the warm stone and ate the oat bread and cheese the farmer's wife had given you, chewing slowly while the silence of the plateau settled around you. The dried apples were sweet and leathery, and you ate them last, one after the other, savouring the faint taste of the orchard where they had grown. While you sat, you reached inside your tunic and drew out the leather pouch, holding it in both hands. The cord was tight, the wax seal unbroken, the leather warm from your body heat. You turned it over, tracing the outline of the letter within with your thumb, a flat rectangle that had not changed since the Count of Foix had pressed it into your hands, what felt like a very long time ago. You did not need to check it, but the habit was strong, and the small ritual of confirming that the seal was whole had become a quiet anchor at the center of each day. You tucked the pouch back inside your tunic, drank from your water bottle, and sat for a while longer, watching the clouds form and dissolve high above the plateau. When you mounted again, the sun was well into the west, and the light had begun to soften, the shadows of the cairns stretching out long and thin across the grass. The track now began to slope downward, almost imperceptibly at first, so that you noticed the change more from the feeling in your legs than from the look of the land. Then the slope steepened, and the grassland gave way to rougher country where heather and bilberry grew among the rocks, their leaves turning bronze with the season. The horizon ahead opened, and you saw far below a wide green valley with the silver river winding through it, and clustered along the river, still 2 days' walk away, but visible now, the roofs and spires of a great abbey town. Cluny. The sight of it after so many days of empty country was almost startling, though you had known it must appear eventually. You reined the horse to a stop and sat looking down at the town, picking out the long roof of the abbey church, the square tower that rose above it, the cluster of smaller buildings huddled around the walls, and the neat pattern of orchards and vineyards that surrounded everything. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, thin threads of grey against the green, and you could just make out the tiny shapes of carts moving on the roads that led to the gates. The river glinted in the late sun, and the whole scene had a calm, ordered beauty that seemed to promise rest. You did not linger long. The light was fading, and you still needed to find shelter for the night. The track descended the escarpment in a series of switchbacks that were easier on the horse than the climb had been that morning, and by the time the sun was touching the western hills, you had reached a lower shelf of the plateau where the land flattened out again. Here, among scattered boulders and patches of rough grazing, stood a shepherd's stone hut, its walls built without mortar from the same grey limestone that littered the slopes. The roof was half open to the sky, its beams exposed where the turf had fallen away, but 3 walls still stood firm, and the corner nearest the door was sheltered and dry. You dismounted and led the horse to a patch of good grass nearby, tethering it to a stone with a long rein so it could graze. The hut was small, no more than a single room, but the floor was of beaten earth, and someone had left a pile of dry bracken in the corner that would serve as a bed. The walls blocked the breeze, and through the gap in the roof you could see the sky deepening to a soft violet, the first stars already visible. You gathered more bracken from outside, the fronds crackling under your hands, and added it to the pile, making a bed thick enough to keep the cold of the ground at bay. You ate the last of the food the farmer's wife had given you, a piece of cheese and the final scrap of bread, sitting in the doorway of the hut while the light drained from the sky. The horse cropped the grass a few yards away, its shape growing dimmer as the dusk thickened, and the only sound was the soft sigh of the breeze through the heather and the distant, bubbling call of a curlew. The air cooled quickly, and you wrapped your cloak around yourself and moved inside, settling into the pile of bracken with your back against the stone wall. The stars came out in their thousands, so many and so bright that the sky seemed almost white with them. And through the broken roof you could see the great band of the Milky Way stretching from one horizon to the other like a river of light. You picked out the constellations as you had done every night of the journey, the Plough, the Hunter, the Great Bear, the Pole Star, steady and true in the north. The letter lay against your chest, its weight a small familiar comfort, and you rested your hand on it without thinking, feeling the outline through the leather. The night grew colder, and you pulled the bracken around you, its dry, earthy scent filling your nostrils. The horse shifted its weight once and then was still, and a fox barked somewhere far out on the plateau, a single sharp sound that faded and left the silence deeper than before. You closed your eyes and listened to the quiet, letting your breathing slow until it matched the rhythm of the breeze in the heather. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the hut held you in its shelter, and after a long while, the boundary between waking and sleep grew thin and then dissolved, and you passed through it without knowing, the letter safe and the journey nearly done. You woke in the shepherd's stone hut as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the gap in the roof, touching the dry bracken of your bed with a pale, cool glow. The air was sharp with the chill of the high country, and your breath rose in small clouds that vanished into the stillness. For a moment you lay without moving, feeling the familiar weight of the leather pouch against your chest. Then you sat up and brushed the bracken fragments from your cloak. The horse stood where you had tethered it, its coat beaded with dew and its breath steaming gently, and it turned its head toward you with a low, soft nicker That was the only sound in the vast quiet of the plateau. You ate the last dried apple from your saddlebag, its flesh leathery and sweet, and then you saddled the horse with slow, deliberate movements, your hands numb from the cold until the work warmed them. The track led away from the hut across a final stretch of high grassland, the sky ahead brightening from pearl to a pale clear blue, and you rode out onto the plateau for the last time as the sun broke free of the horizon and set the limestone outcrops glowing like old bone. The descent began almost at once, the track sloping downward through a series of long, easy gradients that took you off the plateau and into a gentler country of wooded hillsides and small, hidden valleys. The change was gradual but unmistakable. The air grew milder with every 100 paces of descent, losing the thin, sharp edge of the high places and taking on a softer, damper quality that smelled of leaf mold and running water, and the coarse grass and heather gave way to stands of oak and beech, their branches still bare but holding the tight brown buds of the coming spring. The track widened into a proper road, its surface packed hard by the wheels of carts and the feet of many travellers, and you began to see signs of the ordered countryside that surrounded the great abbey, a neatly trimmed hedge, a stone boundary marker carved with a crossed key, a field where the ploughing had been done in straight, careful furrows. The horse seemed to sense that the journey was nearing its end, its pace quickening slightly, and you let it walk on while you watched the landscape open and soften around you. You passed through a village built along the road, its houses of warm honey-coloured stone with roofs of red tile rather than the grey slate you had grown used to, and the street was busy with the morning traffic of carts and handbarrows and people walking to the fields with tools over their shoulders. A woman selling fresh bread from a stall near the well called out her wares in a sing-song voice, and the smell of the warm loaves drifted across the road, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and the earthy smell of the cattle that were being driven to pasture by a boy with a long switch. No one looked at you with more than a passing glance. You were just another traveller on a road that saw many travellers, and you rode through the village without stopping, following the road as it curved past a small church and continued north between orchards where the apple trees were heavy with the last of the autumn fruit. The apples lay in windfalls under the trees, red and gold against the green grass, and a group of children were collecting them into baskets, their laughter carrying across the orchard in bright, brief bursts that faded as you passed. Beyond the village, the road ran alongside a series of fish ponds that belonged to the abbey, their surfaces smooth and brown, fringed with reeds that rustled softly in the light breeze. Monks in brown habits moved along the banks, casting feed into the water from wooden buckets, and the fish rose to the surface in slow, dark swirls that rippled outward and disappeared. One of the monks looked up as you rode by and raised a hand in a quiet greeting, and you returned the gesture, then watched him turn back to his work as the road carried you on. The fish ponds gave way to well-kept vineyards, the vines trained on low trellises and their branches pruned back to neat fists, the soil between the rows clean and free of weeds, and you saw the abbey's winepress in the distance, a long, low building with a tiled roof and a great wooden beam visible through the open doors. The whole landscape had the look of something cared for over centuries, every field and hedge and ditch placed with a purpose that was now so old it had become simply the shape of the land itself. The road grew busier as you drew closer to Cluny, the traffic thickening with carts loaded with barrels of wine and wool bales and sacks of grain, and with people on foot carrying bundles or leading donkeys, and with other riders who passed you with brief nods and continued on their way. The air was filled with the sounds of wheels on packed earth, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional bark of a dog, and underneath it all the distant steady tolling of a bell from the abbey church, a deep, sonorous note that seemed to make the air itself vibrate. You followed the road around a final bend and saw the outer gate of the abbey's domain before you, a great stone archway flanked by 2 square towers and set in a high wall that stretched away into the orchards on either side. The gate stood open, its heavy wooden doors pushed back against the walls, and above the arch a carved panel showed St. Peter holding a key, the stone weathered but still sharp in the clear morning light. You rode through the gate at a walk, joining the stream of traffic that flowed into the abbey precinct. And just inside the arch, a porter in a black habit sat on a stool beside a small writing desk, a ledger open before him, and a quill in his hand. He was an old man with a thin face and spectacles perched on his nose, and he looked up at you with calm, unhurried eyes, asking your business in a voice that was barely above a whisper. You dismounted and produced the merchant's pass from Foix, explaining that you had a letter for the abbot's own hand, and the porter studied the paper for a moment without any change of expression, then nodded and wrote something in the ledger with a slow, careful script. He directed you to the guest-house stables, pointing with the feathered end of his quill toward a long, low building visible beyond the curve of the inner wall, and you thanked him and led your horse away through the press of carts and people. The guest-house stables were clean and orderly, with rows of stalls that smelled of fresh straw and the healthy, warm scent of well-kept horses, and a lay brother in a brown tunic came forward to take your horse from you. He was young and round-faced, with straw stuck to his sleeves, and he led the animal into a stall with the same quiet, competent movements you had come to expect from everyone in this place. You unsaddled the horse for the last time, rubbing it down with a handful of clean straw while it drank from a bucket of fresh water, and you left your saddle and bridle on the rack by the stall before walking out into the stable yard. A stone trough stood against the wall, fed by a pipe that brought water from a spring somewhere up in the hills, and you stopped to wash your face and hands in the cold, clear flow, scrubbing away the dust of the long ride. The water was so cold it made your skin tingle, and you let it run over your wrists and the back of your neck before straightening up and smoothing down your tunic, feeling the shape of the leather pouch beneath the cloth. The inner courtyard of the abbey opened before you as you walked through a narrow passage between the stables and the guest-house, and you paused for a moment to take in the scale of it. The abbey church towered above everything, a vast structure of pale stone with a long nave and a square central tower that rose in tiers of arched windows, its bell just visible as a dark shape in the highest opening. The sound of that bell was still tolling, marking the hour of terce, and each deep note seemed to roll across the courtyard and echo off the surrounding buildings. The courtyard itself was a wide space of packed gravel, busy with monks and lay brothers walking between the church and the cloister and the various workshops, their habits brushing the ground and their sandals making a soft, continuous shuffle that blended into the general murmur of the place. You crossed the courtyard slowly, feeling the gravel crunch under your boots, and you followed the directions the porter had given you toward the abbot's lodging, a separate building that stood to the north of the church, its doorway flanked by two carved pillars and its windows fitted with real glass that caught the light. At the door you found a secretary, a thin man in a black robe with a pale, scholarly face and ink-stained fingers, who looked at you with a calm, expectant expression. You gave him your name and your errand, and he nodded once and led you inside without further question, his soft shoes making no sound on the flagstones. The interior of the abbot's lodging was quiet and warm, the walls panelled in dark wood, and the floor covered with woven rush mats that smelled of dried meadow sweet. And you followed the secretary down a short corridor to a heavy oak door that he opened with a gentle push. The room beyond was a study lined with bookshelves, the shelves filled with leather-bound volumes and rolled parchments, and a fire burned in a small hearth, its flames low and steady, filling the air with the scent of beechwood smoke and the sweet, golden smell of beeswax from the candles that burned on the desk. The abbot sat behind the desk, an old man with white hair and a face that was deeply lined but serene, and he looked up at you with eyes that were the color of pale water, calm and clear, and without any trace of hurry. You stepped forward and unbuttoned the top of your tunic, reaching inside to draw out the leather pouch. The cord came away from its knot with a soft tug, and you held the pouch in your hands for a moment, feeling the shape of the sealed letter within, the same shape you had felt every morning and every night since leaving Foix. Then you placed the pouch into the abbot's outstretched hand, and he received it with a small nod, his fingers closing around the worn leather. He broke the seal with his thumb, the wax cracking with a sound that was very small in the quiet room, and he drew out the folded parchment and began to read while you stood with your hands at your sides, feeling the last of the journey's weight lift from your shoulders. The fire crackled once, a single spark flying up the chimney, and the secretary stood motionless by the door, and the abbot read the letter with slow, attentive eyes, his lips moving slightly over the words. When he had finished, he folded the letter again and placed it on the desk, then looked up at you with that same calm, pale gaze. He spoke a few words very quietly, thanking you for your service and asking the secretary to see that you were given a bed and a meal and whatever else you needed, and then he turned back to the papers on his desk as if you were already gone. The secretary touched your elbow and led you out of the study, along the corridor, and through a side door that opened onto a smaller courtyard where the guest cells were arranged around a tiny garden of lavender and rosemary. The cell he showed you was a small whitewashed room with a single window that looked out onto the garden, and it contained a bed with a wooden frame and a mattress of clean straw covered in linen that smelt faintly of the same lavender that grew outside. A ewer of water and a basin stood on a small table, and a candle waited in a clay holder, and the floor was of smooth, cool stone. You ate a meal that was brought to you on a wooden tray, a bowl of vegetable broth, a piece of fresh bread with butter, and a cup of watered wine that tasted of the abbey's own vineyards. You ate slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed while the light outside the window began to soften toward evening, and when you had finished, you washed your face and hands again, and then lay down on the bed with the linen sheet pulled up to your chin. The mattress cradled your tired body, and the pillow was soft under your head, and you let your eyes close while the sounds of the abbey drifted in through the window. The low murmur of monks singing vespers in the church, the measured tolling of the great bell, and then the smaller bells of the chapels joining in one by one, their notes overlapping and fading and overlapping again. The bells rang for a long time, their sound weaving a slow, peaceful pattern in the evening air, and then they began to fall silent. The smallest bells first, then the middle ones, then the great bell itself, which sounded one last deep note that hung in the darkness and slowly dissolved. In the silence that followed, you felt the last thread of wakefulness slip away, and you slept without dreaming, the journey over and the letter delivered, while the abbey settled into the quiet of the night around you.